Hey everyone, it's Natasha from the blog and YouTube channel Mountain Valley Refuge. And I recently made a bunch of lasagna because I thought if I'm going to go through the effort, I may as well make a whole bunch of lasagna for some other evening dinners. I don't know why I haven't thought about that before. I know people make freezer meals all the time, but I didn't consider actually making a day for specifically freezer meals. And so just this idea of taking what you're already going to make for dinner and just making a whole bunch of it and saving some for other dinners. I just feel like that's such an amazing idea. I can't believe I didn't come up with it before. So I'm going to show you how I made a bunch of lasagna because it is, making one lasagna is not that hard, but it is kind of a lot of work, so I don't make it that often. And I should have known that making a bunch of lasagna would be extra work, but it's so worth it. If you think about it, you would have spent that time every night making those lasagnas in any case. So in a way, if you tally up all the time, you're saving some time. And your kitchen is messy at once and you clean it at once. So good. May as well make a bunch of lasagna if you're gonna make one. But prepare yourself, it is a little bit of extra work. A lot of it. I was tired by the end of it. So a lasagna would consist of pasta, mince, cheese, and a white sauce. And so let me show you how I make our lasagnas and how I made a whole bunch so I could save some in the freezer for other nights. To start, you're going to want to defrost some mincemeat. I took out about 8 pounds of mincemeat. You also want to be defrosting any other things that you're going to be using from your freezer. So if you have some tomato sauce that you froze from the summertime, or if you're going to use any kind of herbs like parsley or basil, go ahead and take those out to defrost also. I started by chopping up some parsley that I bought, a whole bundle from the store, in my food processor. My mistake here. This is not parsley, this is cilantro. Try to remove some of the leaves from the stems, although I wasn't being very careful. If there were some stems in there, that was fine. But if you want to be really meticulous, you could pull off all the leaves and leave the stems. Chop it until it's fine, and then remove it and add it to a separate bowl. Next, I'm going to be chopping some onions. We grew these onions in our garden over the summertime. Oh, wait, before I continue. It's always good to wear an apron when you're working in the kitchen. Put on your apron if you've got one, or if you don't want to ruin your clothes. So as I was saying, these onions, we grew them this summer in our garden. It was really cool to grow onions and see that they actually do bulb up. But the trick with them is that they are harder to peel, so I was spending a lot of time trying to pull off the skins. By the end of it, I was just pulling off a whole layer. Anyway, so roughly an onion is good enough. Now with the mincemeat that I've taken out, that would be roughly 8 onions. But you can look at the sizes and decide for yourself. If you've got one really large onion and one really small one, they could even each other out. So let's say 1 medium onion per lasagna. Then I added it to my food processor, chopped it fine. And then I scraped it out and put it into a container. Because as you can see, we're using this food processor a lot. Which I'll just say here, shout out to this great food processor. It is such a time saver in the kitchen and takes work that would take really long or could be quite difficult if you're doing a lot of it, and just does it really quickly. Then I got the garlic ready. This is actually for the white sauce that comes later, but while we're doing the prep work, go ahead and chop your garlic. I'm doing about 3 cloves of garlic. So if I'm gonna do 1 pound of mincemeat, I would, for easy math, you could say that there's about 1 cup of white sauce per lasagna. So for that, I'm gonna do 3 garlic cloves per cup of white sauce. Now you can add to that or take away however you feel your taste buds are. We really love garlic, so that's why I'm adding lots of it, and I feel it to be the secret recipe for my white sauce. So lots of garlic for us. And then of course, you be the judge, right? Some garlic cloves are giant, some are small, so when we say 3 garlic cloves per pound of mince. You know, it depends. Are they giant? Are they small? You decide for yourself. And as you use garlic over the years, you'll find a balance that you really like in your food. So I added the garlic to my food processor and chopped them fine. Now that that prep work's out of the way, let's get the mincemeat in the pot. So I'm using a big pot with a drizzle of olive oil. And I'm gonna add all of the mincemeat at once to cook in the pot. Now that may seem like it wouldn't be a good idea if you're trying to cook a lot of mincemeat at once, but if you keep stirring it, all of the mincemeat will touch the bottom and cook at some point. And you'll see it'll cook down quite a bit as it's browning, so it's fine. About 8 pounds of mincemeat in this pot will cook just fine. You don't have to do it separately. Even though you're gonna see that later, I will split the mincemeat once I start adding the tomatoes and tomato paste. We also have a 1 pound of mincemeat that our landlords gave us, which is some wild game mincemeat. So I'm cooking that in a separate pot in the back here, just because I want to give Walter a taste when he gets home before I mix everything in. Oh yeah, so this mincemeat is just beef mince. You can do a combination of mince that is beef and pork, or beef and lamb, or however you choose. We just have beef mince on hand, and so I'm using all beef mince, except for that 1 pound that is wild game meat. While that's cooking down, I'm gonna chop up some of these peppers. Now you don't need to add peppers to your lasagna, but I have them on hand and I've been playing around with these green peppers, so I feel like they will add a nice kick to the lasagna. So if you've got green peppers, go ahead and prepare them here. Chop off the tops and slice them in half, and then very carefully remove that inner seam where the seeds are. Yeah, make sure you wash your hands after you use these green peppers because anything you touch will burn. I am not using a great knife here. I know, do not do as I'm doing. Just be safe with your knife skills and ignore that I'm being very unsafe with my knife at this point. But come on, we all do it. We test the limits with our knives. This knife is getting kind of dull, so I feel it's acceptable, but you need to exercise some smart knifing skills and do not do as I do. Unless you have a dull knife like me and you know you can push that limit. Then I added my green peppers to the food processor. First, I put it through the top, which will slice it, but it didn't slice it thin enough for me. So I added back in the blade just to chop the green peppers very fine. And then I removed that from my food processor and added it to another bowl. Now you're constantly going to be stirring your mincemeat, so keep an eye on it, make sure it doesn't burn, and you want it to cook through, so keep stirring regularly. Next, it was time to chop the mushrooms. This would have probably been a good vegetable to put through the slicer instead of the chopper. But by the time I realized that I'd already chopped too much of it, which worked out fine because we love mushrooms, but I don't love it that much that I would just sit and eat chunks of mushroom every night. Anyway, this worked out really well because I could just add the fine mushrooms to the mincemeat later, and you don't really know you're eating vegetables, but it is in the mince, making it hearty and giving us all that good mushroom nutrients that we need. Again, stirring the mince, constantly stirring. My stove is on medium to high, kind of leaning toward the high end of that, because I want this mincemeat to be cooking quickly. While the mincemeat is cooking, I got another pan to start browning the onions. I added a drizzle of olive oil and then put some of my onions in to start browning. While that's going, I'm gonna add the spices to the meat. So I added some oregano, add the rest of the onions to get it all caramelized. salt, basil, dried basil, I don't have any fresh ones, and parsley, and then some paprika. Mix that all very well. Make sure it gets a good stir through to mix it really, really well. Give the onions a stir, and then I turned it up because it was going way too slow. With everything on high heat, I was watching a little bit more closely. Once the onions looked like they had a nice brown color, I added it to my minced meat and stirred it in. Once the meat is nicely browned and cooked through, we can move to the tomato stage. Now before I move to the next step of adding tomato sauce and paste, my pot is already way too full, and so I grabbed another pot and I'm going to split this in half. I also added in some of that wild meat that I was telling you I had, and just left a little bite for Walter to try. So now I basically have 4 pounds of minced meat in each pot, roughly. Cleaned off my stove, and now it is time to add in the tomato sauce. Now you could add whole tomatoes here from a can, you could add diced tomatoes. I have tomato sauce that we made in the summer from our garden's tomatoes, so I went ahead and used that here. I'm going to do about a cup of tomato sauce per pound of meat, so that's 4 cups of tomato sauce per pot. The tomato puree or sauce is a bit more watery than whole tomatoes or diced tomatoes from a can would be, so I'm really going to have to cook down the meat so that it's not too saucy by the time I combine my lasagna. So I repeated it for the other pot, also 4 cups of puree sauce. And next I'm going to add in a jar of tomato paste per pot. The jar is a few ounces, so that's just what I had. I didn't measure. It should be alright. You can never go wrong with adding too much tomato paste actually, because it'll just thicken up your tomato sauce in the mince. So if you see that it's a bit runny and you've got extra tomato paste, just add it. Can't hurt it. It's not going to change the flavor dramatically or anything like that. It'll just help thicken it up. So I stirred in my tomato paste. It smells delicious. So as you can see, the meat looks so good with the tomato sauce added. Now I'm adding in the finely chopped mushrooms, which will hide well with this mince. And then give it a taste. I should have done this earlier too when I added the spices for the first time. Give it a taste so you know if you should add more, if something needs more, or if something that's too much and you need to combat it with something else. Anyway, this is good. I'm also going to add in the green peppers that I chopped up earlier just to give it that final zing. And I'm keeping my pots on the back of my stove cooking on medium, just so that they can kind of cook down and let all that sauce cook nicely into the mince, and also reduce, because like I said earlier, you don't want it too runny. Now I'm starting my white sauce. Before you do this, it's quite a mission to do 2 white sauces at once, because you really need to wash it, so you want to stay close at hand for this one. So to do this, I added butter to each pan. Once it's melted, add some of the flour, and then you want to be stirring vigorously to get that butter to mix well with the flour. In a sense, the flour will cook in the butter. And by cook, it like kind of cooks out that flour taste. Once it looks like they've combined nicely together, go ahead and add a splash of milk, and now the milk will help create the start of this liquid as the flour and the butter kind of like starts to thin out. Slowly keep adding milk bit by bit. You'll see here that I am just adding without measuring, because I just want to start that initial kind of sauce, not really at the point yet where I'm making the sauce. I'm just starting the base of it. I use a fork to stir because I just feel like it responds better to my hand as I'm vigorously stirring, making sure that it's not sticking to the bottom of the pan to burn, and also I feel like it does a greater job at not getting stuck in the fork, so the flour is constantly touching the bottom of the pan and cooking through well. So as it's cooking, remember to keep stirring the mince so that it can cook through well. Once it looks like the new milk that you added is well combined with the flour and the butter, go ahead and add some more milk, and then when you're ready, measure in the actual amount of milk that you would expect to turn to sauce. So I'm going to use about, like I said, a cup of milk per pound of mince, or a little bit more. I mean, if you want to be lenient with your white sauce, do a little bit more. Now you're continually stirring, making sure that that butter-flour mixture mixed well with all this new milk that's coming. Basically, it'll mix well, and then you'll kind of have this milky consistency of a sauce. But with that starter, it's gonna sort of take over your milky sauce and thicken it up over time. About 20 to 25 minutes. And that's how long it'll also take for your mincemeat and tomato mixture. My pan is on low to medium heat, kind of leaning toward the lower side of that. So you'll see I'm constantly stirring, making sure that my milk is not burning to the bottom of my pan. Now for my milk to thicken up, I'm gonna let it cook for a little while. So I'm turning my stove down to low to medium for this milk, kind of leaning toward the lower side of that. Now while those things are cooking, I'm getting ready to combine everything together. So I'm gonna lay out my pans and set up kind of a buffet style setup so that I can just breeze through each item and create layers as I go. Now, a good tip here is to, instead of using tinfoil pans every time, you could do that to start, but if you're gonna do this often, you may as well go get some of these pans and have them extra on hand so that you can just always use them to make extra meals. You don't have to keep buying tinfoil pans. So I got a few extra pans from Value Village, so if you're there next time, you can look, they usually have some in the kitchen aisle. I'm still watching my minced meat, I'm watching my sauce, coming back regularly to stir, making sure nothing's burning. When the sauce is semi-stiffened, like you can see that it's kind of getting there, now's the time to add the nutmeg and the garlic. About 15 minutes after you initially added the milk. This just gives it a nice flavor. And then of course the secret ingredient, all of that garlic. Now let that continue to cook for a little longer and grate your cheese. Earlier in the week, I grated a whole bunch of cheese for another meal, so I have some left over already, ready to use for this. You're gonna wanna go ahead and grate more cheese than you would think. You can always have extra and save it in your fridge or in your freezer, but you don't wanna get to the combining stage and not have enough cheese. Cheese is a very important part of lasagna. I added some salt. And this would be a good time to try it also, see how it tastes. I like to add a little bit of cheese here if I see that it just needs a little help to go a little bit quicker. That sort of melts into the sauce and helps create just a bit of thickening. I can see that my sauce is starting to thicken up nicely. It takes time, so be patient with it. Even if it looks like it's not working, looking very milky, just give it time, very low heat. Continue to stir it, it will come together for you. Now the pasta noodles that you buy from the store kind of mess me up. I used to think that you need to cook them for a certain amount of time until they're soft before you can even add them to the lasagna, and that's just not the case. When I was making a lasagna for my in-laws one time and couldn't afford to mess it up, my friend Carla gave me a really good idea to just add the pasta layers to a pan with water and let them cook while you're getting the rest of your lasagna ready. So I did that and it worked perfectly. So as long as they're semi-soft or heading towards soft, that's totally fine because the rest of it will cook when it's in the oven. Now I like to add boiling water just to sort of help move that process along, especially if you didn't start it from the beginning but you're just halfway through adding your pasta to the pan. Go ahead and add some boiling water just to, you know, get that cooking process along quicker. So I laid out a bunch of lasagna and then I decided it would be easier if I did one by one. So I start with a layer of pasta and then I'm adding my mincemeat. Mine is still pretty runny, so I'm draining off a bit of that sauce so that I'm not bringing over a bunch of liquid unnecessarily. What you could do to get around that, there are some brands that sell a tomato, what is it called? Kind of like a tomato sauce thickener, which is delicious and would be perfectly acceptable to use. I didn't have any on hand, so I'm just taking it a little longer to drain off the liquid before I add it to the lasagna. Next, add a layer of the white sauce mixed with cheese. Once you have your first base done, go ahead and repeat it a second time. Ideally, it would be so great if you could get 3 layers of the pasta, mince, white sauce, and cheese. But depending on how thick how deep your pans are, you may only be able to get 2 layers like I'm doing here, and that's totally fine. It still tastes just as good. Now there isn't really a right or wrong here, although there would probably be a better way. It is best not to end off with pasta unless you're going to cover it in cheese, because if your top layer is just some pasta, it'll cook really hard in the oven. So have something cover at least a pasta layer. Now, of course, the first lasagna that is done is for dinner. That's a part of the inspiration to get all these lasagnas done, is to get all the steps done, because one lasagna is actually for dinner, so it needs to get done. So I made my first one, put it into the oven, and baked it around 350 degrees Celsius for around 20 to 25 minutes. The last 5 minutes or so, I'll put it on broil just to give that cheese on top a really good browning, which is delicious. Everyone loves a little bit of fried cheese. While that's baking in the oven, I'm going ahead and making those extra lasagnas that I'm telling you about. So I have extra pasta that I'm using, the extra mince and white sauce, and I'm just making a few lasagna meals here. Now this is exhausting. By this time you've prepared all the parts, you've made one lasagna, you feel accomplished, and then you still have all this stuff in front of you to finish more lasagnas. It's so worth it. Just keep thinking about the fact that in a few weeks from now, or days, I don't know, you'll be eating these lasagnas that you would have labored for a long time ago, and that night you don't have to. So it's so worth it. Go ahead and make a few extra lasagnas. When you've got them prepared, cover them with tin foil and freeze them right away. So my 8 pounds of meat made me about 3 lasagnas. So my math was a bit off. So it takes about 3 pounds of minced meat per lasagna. And if one lasagna has a little less of something or another a little more, it doesn't matter. Lasagna is a lasagna. It's homemade. it'll still taste delicious. And that's how you make 3 lasagnas instead of 1. Alright, well thank you so much for watching. I hope that that's helpful to you, and next time you make lasagna, you can also make a bunch of lasagna so that you can save yourself the effort a few lasagnas down the road. If you like content like this, it'd be great if you could subscribe and then watch our next video.